All right, great. We have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to start with a question. Anybody know where this is? Not Grand Canyon. Someplace much better. It's the Escalante Canyon regions in southern Utah, and it's one of the best places in the world, and it's one of the best kept secrets in the United States. It's one of my favorite places to go camping. Because Escalante is, I don't know if you can really see here, it's a series of these descending plateaus, and they're carved out through all of these rivers and wind erosion over the years, and they're bracketed by these beautiful mountain ranges all along, and you can go into these narrow little slot canyons, and so it's both intimate, and then you come out of it, and there's this grand vista that's there. And the most amazing thing about Escalante is that the vestiges of wind and water erosion are just everywhere, and it unveils time in this epic, time is not just in millions of years, it's in hundreds of millions of years in terms of its revelation. And this becomes even more apparent at night. When you go out to Escalante, because there aren't really many settlements around there, there's almost no light pollution, and the nighttime stars in Escalante are just really profound. So it's a place that's just fascinating and wonderful in so many ways. And so I have this thing though, whenever I go camping in Escalante, and I'm out, it's usually something like this, out under the nighttime sky, and I'm faced with just this timeless landscape, and I can't help but wondering, why am I here? What is this all about? It's a really kind of profound place to go to, and probably you've had experiences like this in other places. We usually have these out in nature, where we're confronted with this sort of timelessness of this, reality that we seem to be encountering. And if you were to go back in time and ask anyone at any other time and place in human history for the most part, and you ask them, why were they here? Well, they had a ready answer for you. They were here to serve their gods. These were people who were largely ensconced in myth. And as he describes, they had these origin myths that were incredibly important for them for sort of situating and knowing what their purpose was. And they used these myths and they drew on these myths to then give themselves a place of security in the universe. And so for example, take the Christian Bible. This is probably in our Western tradition, the myth that we're most kind of ensconced in. And the Christian Bible, gives us some reasons for our purpose for living. It basically says we're here to rule over nature, as it's in Genesis, to serve God's glory, and to satisfy God's pleasure. And for Western Europeans, for the past couple of thousand years, that's been good enough. Now, obviously, though, in the past century, that's become undone. As I'm going to continue to talk about here, one of the issues we have, and one of the reasons why we have this class, is that these old myths and old stories that used to tell us our purpose aren't really holding up very well in the face of modern science anymore. And we seem to need more. We seem to need more than oftentimes what these old functional myths for our ancestors would do for us. And so the question is how do we go about finding our purpose? Now, if I know a lot of you, we find our purpose in new and other kinds of ways. So for example, I know a lot of people, and particularly young people, they find purpose in chasing their peak experiences. I spent a lot of my 20s basically living from one peak experience to the next. And I would go and chase some peak experience and it would be great. And then I'd be like, okay, how can I get my next peak experience? Other people find their purpose by sort of achieving certain kind of life goals. I want to have that perfect house. I want to get that great job. I want to find the perfect partner. That's going to be my purpose. So a lot of people find purpose and meaning in helping other people. But there's an issue here that still doesn't necessarily, we are finding our purpose in basically idiosyncratic ways. And is there maybe a more systematic way where we can kind of look around, and once again, if you go on the web, you can find ideas about what your purpose is. Oftentimes you'll see these kind of Venn diagrams here, and they're really great. You've got to find what you love, what the world needs, what you're good at, and of course, what they'll pay you for. And if you can find the sort of center focus of that, well, that's your purpose. And well, maybe at some level, yes, but that's also perhaps a little shallow. It doesn't necessarily get at sort of deeper existential questions. So what I'm going to try to talk about today is how we can maybe get a more systematic understanding of what our purpose is. And to do that, I'm going to borrow it. At least I'm going to start with one of the greatest philosophers of Western civilization, Aristotle. And with his typical straightforward logic, Aristotle basically said that if you want to know anything's purpose, look at its function. So take, for example, a hammer. The function of a hammer is to smash things like nails and smash them well. And what does that mean? A great hammer is something that's great at smashing things. It's strong, it's sturdy, it's reliable. It's going to smash things really efficiently. This is what makes an excellent hammer. And the Greeks, in their philosophical tradition, were really into excellence. They basically said our purpose in life was to pursue this excellence. They had a term for it called eudaimonia. And it basically means, it often gets translated as happiness, but it's not really happiness. It's about living well and living in the best possible way you can, and by doing this, understanding your function. So in a lot of ways, if we really want to know what our purpose is, we need to first start with what our function is. And so maybe the better question for this week is, what is our function? I think if I had asked you to think on that, that would have seemed kind of strange. So, we typically get this understood as, what is our purpose? But maybe what is our function is a better way of thinking about this. Okay, so how do we know what our function is? Well, one way to look at this would be to look at psychology. And if you look at, because psychology is really explaining how our minds work, how our thoughts work, how our emotions work, seems like it would be a pretty good place to sort of understand what our function is. Now, here's the interesting thing about psychology, and particularly up until recently. If you look at psychology and it looks at our function, it gives a pretty dark picture. So if you were to pick up, for example, any psychology textbook from, like, say 30 or 40 years ago going backwards, it would focus on things like anxiety, neurosis, depression, mental health ills, instability of identity, insecurity. Any idea why psychology up until this point was such a dark science? Well, think about it. When psychology started as a science, what was it basically focusing on? It had three kind of main subject areas. It had, in the, say, Freudian tradition, had people who had mental illnesses. So psychology was born out of trying to help people who had all sorts of mental problems. Then when psychology moved into the academy, they started doing theories of brain and brain function. So it started looking at, trapped laboratory animals. And then as psychology even progressed further, the next subject became college sophomores. And if you think about what all three of these have in common, it may be anxiety, insecurity, uncertainty. And so a lot of what informed psychology was its source material, and a lot of its source material was not necessarily people in their optimal prime. And there was a guy who kind of recognized this, and you probably heard of him. His name is Abraham Maslow. He was one of the great psychologists of the 20th century. And starting around the mid-century, he said, we want to do something in psychology that should be different than just studying sick people or studying pathology. He wanted to study thriving people. He wanted to understand, what was it that made people who were really just functioning well, what was it that was just behind their great functioning? And so he came up with this, and you're probably familiar with this, you may have encountered it. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's a brilliantly simple and clear depiction of sort of the hierarchy of human motivations and what our functions are from those motivations. And so it basically starts with our base physiological needs, starting with breathing, eating, sleeping, all the things we need to make just this mechanism of our body function. If you are suddenly deprived of oxygen, if you suddenly have no water, if you don't have any food, that's what you're going to focus on. You're going to focus first and foremost on meeting those physiological needs. You can't really think about anything else. Once you have those met, then you move up to sort of the next layer and hierarchy of needs, and this is your security and safety. You want to make sure no one's going to come and get you. You want to make sure that you're feeling safe and secure. There's not a lion that's on the hill that's going to come and pounce on you. After that, there's an idea of belonging. We are a social species. We want to find people to connect with. So you feel safe, you feel fed, you're breathing okay. All right, where are my people? Let's bring them together. Let's find my tribe. Get me connected to my tribe. Let me find people I'm connecting with. And then, of course, once I'm in my tribe, I want to feel good about myself. So I start doing things to make myself feel good about myself. I start serving needs of self-esteem, what we might call ego needs. I'm going to talk more about these later on in the course. And what Maslow said is that if you look at most people, this is the hierarchy of their needs. They basically prioritize these things in these orders, and these are the things that they basically pursue. However, he said, if you look at really high functioning people, really splendid, wonderful people, the Eleanor Roosevelts, the Mahatma Gandhis, the people who we really hold up as sort of like paragons of just, exemplary human virtue and thriving, they do something else. They go up to this top level, which is self-actualization. Now, the term self-actualization, you hear quite a bit, and to me it's in kind of a misnomer, because actualize, to the literal meaning of the term actualize, means to make a reality out of something. But as we've seen already, the self has a reality. Remember, the self are all those processes that are negotiating between your life force and reality, and the self is existing anywhere you are on this scheme. Perhaps a better word that we could put up there is just about self-flourishing or self-optimization, or as I like to say, transcendence. And as you might recognize, sort of the model that I'm coming and using to describe the self, in a lot of ways tracks with what Maslow was saying. We're going to start looking at ourselves from sort of this base physiological perspective, which is the cellular self. We're going to look up at our animal selves. And then particularly this idea of a linguistic community in terms of bringing us together and binding us as a whole. The egoistic self is really about like our esteem needs. And what Maslow terms self-actualization, I would call the transcendent self. But so you can see Maslow's really influenced my thinking about the self here, and I'm borrowing a lot to sort of describe this in my model of the self. The problem with Maslow, or I should say in the way that Maslow often gets interpreted, is that he's often misinterpreted. So for example, Maslow never depicted the hierarchy of needs as a pyramid. And you often see things like this, like it's a pyramid you have to climb. And I've got to I've got to get that great job so I can meet my basic physiological needs and comfort. And then I got to have those great friends, and I got to find that great partner. And then I'm going to do all these great things in the world. And it's like a video game where you move up from one level to the next level to the next level, and then you become triumphant. And that's not what Maslow was talking about. And I want to give you an example of this. I was watching recently this documentary about Greg LeMond. I don't know if you know who he is. He was the first American to win the Tour de France in the 1980s. And that's a remarkable thing to do. You have to work so hard and train so hard. And the Tour de France is one of the most grueling sports events you can imagine. And Greg LeMond wins it, and immediately after he wins it, he becomes incredibly depressed. And he's depressed for a couple of reasons. I think just a letdown of like, oh my God, I worked so hard and this is it. But more importantly, there were some early childhood traumas. He was basically sexually abused for several years as a boy. And he was terrified that now that he was so famous from winning the Tour de France, that this shameful experience he had was going to come to light. And he freaked out about it. And so this is the problem with self-actualizing in this particular way, is you really need to, we think about self-actualization as, pursuing this kind of perfect life relative to these external goals, but that's really focusing probably more on just one layer of the pyramid. It's probably the esteem level of the pyramid. And if we really want to flourish, if we really want to thrive, what we need to do is figure out how we can find balance at all layers of ourself simultaneously. This is how we really flourish. This is what our purpose should be. If we want to find eudaimonia, if we want to really thrive, if we want to optimize our function, we need to do it at every single layer of the self. And so what I want to talk about today are the first two layers of the self. I'm going to talk about the cellular self, and I want to talk about the animal self, and how we might find some kind of balance and optimization at those levels. All right, the cellular self. If we want to know these levels of ourselves, probably the best place to look is biology. We are animals, we are living systems. Biology is the study of living systems. And biology has made amazing progress in the past 200 years. It's really phenomenal how much more we know about living systems thanks to biology. If we really want to understand what our function is, we should probably start with where we started from. And so we want to start with where we started from. We've got to go back to the beginning of life. Now, there is a problem here. We don't really know exactly when or how life began. We have some pretty good theories now from a scientific perspective about that life probably started emerging in some sort of ocean thermal vents where there was free energy and you had these chemicals that started kind of cohering together and having kind of these metabolic reactions, and somehow or another they began forming to sustain these metabolic reactions. And those are the theories, and they're pretty good and they're pretty advanced. We don't know them for sure. Problem is that early life didn't leave much of a fossil record, or no fossil record, and it's likely that there was no one divine spark which lit life up. Instead, life probably needed a lot of sparks to keep going. So if we really want to know when life truly began, we actually have to go forward in time a couple 100 million years from when scientists believe life was sort of first sparking. And this is a creature we'll find here called LUCA, which stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. And LUCA is remarkable. LUCA is basically the greatest grandparent to you, to me, to all living things on the planet. So ourselves, whales, redwood trees, slime mold, microscopic bacteria, all of us trace our origins back to LUCA. There are about 350 genes that you can find in any living creature, and they all trace back to LUCA. And so biologists have kind of reverse engineered, and they anticipate that LUCA probably lived around 3.7 billion years ago. And so LUCA then takes us to this first layer of self, the cellular self. And what was LUCA basically doing? As I described in the last lecture, LUCA was there to resist entropy. It was an energy system that was contained in its cellular metabolism, and it was resisting entropy and keeping itself going as an energy system. The interesting thing about cells, they were basically first discovered by this guy, who's probably one of the smartest guys that most people have never heard of. His name was Robert Hooke. He was a contemporary of Isaac Newton in England. He was a polymath. He was an overall genius. He basically invented science of everything from optics to elasticity. He actually claimed and had a big fight with Isaac Newton because he said he also kind of independently invented gravitational theory. They fought with each other all their lives. Legend has it that Isaac Newton conveniently lost his painting for the Royal Society of his portrait, which would be the kind of 17th century equivalent of ghosting someone or canceling them, I guess. And so this is probably why you know less about Robert Hooke. And by all accounts, he was really vain, egotistical, cantankerous, but he invented his own microscope. And with this microscope, he started peering into sort of the small substrate of tiny creatures. And one of the things he was doing, he was looking at cork cells. He was looking at cork, and he would look at the sort of thin layer of cork. And what he basically saw was something like this. And this is actually his drawing here. And he was like, wow, cork is not a solid thing. It's not a solid mass. It's made up of a lot of different little constituent parts. And he was looking at them, and he said, huh, you know what these parts look like? They look like little rooms. And the Latin term for room is cella. That's where we get the term cellar from. So he said, I'm going to call them cells. And hence the name cell was born. Now, the problem is, had Hooke been perhaps maybe a more gregarious personality, or perhaps maybe had a better microscope, or he was actually looking at living tissue, he probably wouldn't have chosen the room as the term for it, or an empty room as the term for it. Because if you actually look inside of a cell, what you'll see is not like a barren room. You'll see something more like this. It's a raucous party. Within of your cells are just innumerable numbers of molecular elements jostling about, engaged in frenetic and energetic activity, bumping into each other, knocking things over, kind of throwing it all around. You know, your cellular membrane is like the bouncer for the party, kind of only letting certain guests in and keeping other guests out. And this is really a better apt description of a cell. It is vibrant. the one thing to know is, yes, you're comprised of all these little bitty different parts, but they are just thrumming with vibrancy. Now, this goes back to what I was talking about last week in terms of, well, what is a well-functioning self? How do you contain, it's about containing this vibrancy. How do you keep that vibrancy alive and going in just the right way so it doesn't spin out of control? So imagine, once again, a party. Great party, has great guests, great food, great music, but you don't want it to get all chaotic because someone's going to call the police and shut the party down. But you don't want a party to be sterile and dull either, because then everyone's going to leave. You want that sort of just right balance. And this is more or less what a cell is trying to do. It's trying to keep that right balance of vitality going. And the way it does that, and the primary way it does this is through order, and the primary way it finds order is through DNA. Now, you're all familiar with DNA, and the funny thing about DNA is actually a remarkably recent discovery. It's only from the 1950s that we know about the structure of DNA, and there's been so many advances since this time. And DNA is really a true marvel of nature, you know, and everything from its elegant double helix structure to the fact that it's the operating manual for you and me. And it really determines so much about it. It determines our physical structure. It determines a lot of our personalities. It determines things like, you know, whether or not we like cilantro. And it's easy, particularly given sort of the growth of companies that will read your DNA for you, like Ancestry.com or 23andMe, to begin to identify yourself with your DNA. It's oftentimes easy to think that, oh, I am my DNA. And I know, like, I've gone on Ancestry.com and I did this sort of thing, and I was like, oh, wow, you know, here I am, and I don't have a balding spot or back hair. Yeah, I know myself. And, you know, or I could find out all my ancestors all came from Northern Europe. Yay, I know that. I know myself. And the problem with identifying yourself overly with your DNA is that your DNA is pretty indifferent to you as a living being. It's just basically a collection of genes, and a haphazard collection of genes. You took 50% of your genes came from your mom and 50% from your dad, and you didn't really have much control over it. They just sort of randomly were selected to come together. What's more, if you even have children, you'll only pass on 50% of your DNA, and you don't have any control over which 50% you pass on. And so I see this with my kids. I look at them and I'm like, oh, you got that from me. I am so sorry. You know, remember, your DNA is just there to structure and order your cell's vitality. It's not really definitive of who you are. If you took your DNA out of your cells, it would be inert. It would be lifeless. It has no vitality in and of itself. It is simply just a mechanism of ordering your cell structure. And that's really what it basically does. If you really want to know what makes you, it's not just your DNA, it's all the other things that are happening within your cells. It's the vitality within your cell. Like I said before, and I want to emphasize this again and again, we oftentimes misunderstand ourselves because we want to think of ourselves as things, and that's why we identify with our DNA. Our DNA is a thing. You know, it's this chain of molecules, and we say, okay, here, it's legible, it's a thing, it's what I am. It's not. We are processes. Everything that's going on in your head right now, all of your thoughts, they're just processes that are continuing, and they're processes that are coming from the vitality within your cells, the energetic metabolic fire that continues to burn within your particular cells. But we totally misunderstand this all the time. I'll give you another example here. We got a beautiful person here, gorgeous, and we think, okay, here's this beautiful person. God, everything about them, just the life and beauty and wonder. But what are you seeing of this person? Anybody know? You're seeing dead cells. All you're actually seeing of this person are their dead cells. You're not seeing their live cells. You're seeing skin cells, the upper layers of the epidermis are dead. Hair is not a living cell. Basically, if you don't have eyes open, you're not seeing the eyes. It's the only sort of really kind of like vibrant living cells that you see in someone. And that's one reason why our eyes, I think, are so compelling, because they are one of the most, you know, readily visible living parts of us. And you can see that if like someone like goes like this, they may be dead. This is where life comes from. Life comes from movement within us. It doesn't come from this. And the irony is that we kind of equate this with ourselves, but this is the part of us that is not living. If you look at the part of us that actually is living, that's vibrant, it's alive, it's gross. Sorry. So the function of yourself then is to keep order and vitality in homeostatic balance. It's to keep these things, keep the party basically going at just the right level.
So if Aristotle says that we know our purpose by knowing our function, and the function of our cells is to exist in homeostatic balance, then what can we do to actually promote our cells? And the answer to this question is kind of surprising, because if you look back across human history, up until quite recently, the really only thing we could do to keep ourselves healthy was to keep ourselves alive. As long as we were getting enough food and not getting eaten by some other creature, then we were probably doing all that we could to keep ourselves healthy.
Now, once humans started living in permanent settlements about 10,000 years ago, this started changing and their ecology started changing. Not only were they were kind of more, they were surrounded by their own feces and waste product. They started domesticating animals, and so they had animals cohabitating with them. And these basically became huge germ factories. And so with permanent settlements came a rise in all kinds of new diseases. And basically this has progressed now for the past 10,000 years. The biggest threat to ourselves is not, not getting enough food or not having security. We have all of those. It's actually the technologies we use to accomplish those particular goals. And you can read the history of civilization as all of our great triumphs and achievements, and that's great. But the history of civilization really can also be read as the growth of pathogens and disease, just as easily as our great civilizations here. So the question is okay, well, how can we combat that? And the one thing to do is to know how a lot of these diseases operate. And this is once again where biology comes in, because in the 1950s, we basically started understanding what was going on within the molecular structure of our cells. And basically scientists began to realize that, cells in terms of their molecules have sort of their own molecular integrity. And one of the things that's threatening to a cell, and this is something you've probably heard of, is called a free radical. So it goes around and it basically does this by looking at other molecules within your cells and stealing electrons from them. Now the problem is that because that causes degeneration in other parts of your cells. And so if you have too many free radicals, your cells will begin to fall apart. And this is oftentimes what's thought to be the source of most cancers, is free radicals coming in, invading the cells, deteriorating your DNA structure, and kind of screwing up sort of the basic mechanisms within your cell that sort of have them reproduce and die off in a regularized way. And so when we discovered this, we realized that, a lot of the toxins that are in our environment are toxic precisely because they're introducing a lot of free radicals into us. And so if you think about a lot of the environment that we live in, we've got a lot of air pollution that we're subjected to, we have a lot of plastics, we have a lot of food additives. All of these things are probably introducing an extraordinary number of free radicals into our system. And smoking is, I think in the 20th century was the greatest sort of source of free radicals. And that's hence we saw the rise in lung cancer with the rise of smoking. Now, interestingly, nature also has an alternative or a remedy for this problem, and it's called antioxidants. And antioxidants are molecules that can easily shed off an extra electron and not be disrupted. And the person who really advocated this and really made this popular was this guy Linus Pauling, who you might have heard of. Linus Pauling was one of the most remarkable people in the 20th century. He was a path-breaking chemist. He won 2 Nobel Prizes, one for chemistry and one for peace. He was basically the reason why we don't test atomic weapons above ground anymore, was because of his efforts. He's the only person in history who, by himself, has won 2 unshared Nobel Prizes. So he's literally like a scientist and a saint. And he made so many contributions to us. He's really great. But ironically, the thing that he was most proud of when he was dying was something that is probably least helpful for us. And the adage of why, when you get a cold, why you want to take vitamin C? It was basically him. He wrote this book in the 1960s called Vitamin C and the Common Cold. And vitamin C has a lot of antioxidants in it. It's really great. And that's why, it's so important for us to get it. We as primates can't normally metabolize vitamin C on our own. We have to get it from an external source. So that's why there's scurvy that was bad in the Navy, the 19th century navies, because they weren't getting enough vegetables and fruits that had vitamin C. And so Pauling basically said, okay, vitamin C has all of these antioxidants, it's rich in antioxidants. That's a term you hear a lot today when people are describing foods. If I just take tons and tons of vitamin C, it's going to flush out all these diseases, all of these toxins, and I'll be on a cure to great health. And he kind of went off the bend on this. Like he basically started saying that, you know, vitamin C would cure cancer, vitamin C could cure AIDS. All of these things that we know are not the case. We don't really know. We know antioxidants are important, but we actually don't know their specific functions. So it's not like you can improve your cell's functionality by going to the health food store and then taking all of these particular substances, the particular supplements. The science about this is still pretty unclear about how that. And in fact, you need some free radicals because they can actually protect you from some diseases. Now, so what does this mean? How then can we optimize our cellular cells? And actually, it's kind of banal. The advice and the scientific consensus is what we look at boils down to 6 pieces of advice. And they're pretty straightforward and are probably something that you already know. So eat a diet with lots of vegetables and whole grains. Avoid refined carbohydrates, alcohol. Don't smoke, abuse drugs. Exercise regularly. Try to get at least 7.5 hours of sleep a night. And try to have regular contact with loved ones. And I mean like face-to-face contact with loved ones. Try to engage in social activities with loved ones at least every day. People who do these 6 things live longer, healthier, and happier lives. And I think one reason they do that is they have great cellular health. Weirdly enough, these things all contribute to cellular functionality. And since we can't really see ourselves, these are probably the best things that we can do to promote cellular functionality. Okay, great. Seems really straightforward. What's the problem with this list? They're really hard to follow. I don't know about you. I mean, I know this, and I try to live a good life, and I try to optimize myself. I find it really hard to resist junk food, to resist alcohol, you know, to hole up by myself, you know, in front of the TV with a big pint of ice cream and not want to talk to anyone. You know, I know what I need to do to make my cells healthy, but for some reason, it's really, really hard to do these basic pieces of advice. It takes an enormous amount of discipline. The question we need to answer is, why is that? And the answer goes back to the song that I was playing at the beginning of class. I don't know if you know Atomic Dog by George Clinton, one of the great funk songs of all time. And the line is, you know, why must I be like that? Why must I chase the cat? Nothing but the dog in me. And this is really what it is. What is it that about us that keeps us from keeping our cells healthy? And it's the animal self. And so what I want to spend the second half of the lecture talking about here is this next layer of being, the animal self.